Our speaker today is Priya Fielding-Singh, who is coming to us from the University of Utah. Dr. Fielding-Singh is a sociologist and an ethnographer. She is currently assistant professor of family and consumer studies at the University of Utah. She received her PhD in sociology from Stanford University, and we were talking about Stanford quite a bit today. It's a wonderful place to go get your PhD. I recommend it to everyone. She completed a postdoctoral fellowship as a National Institutes of Health scholar at the Stanford University School of Medicine. Her research and writing examines issues of social and economic justice with a focus on families, food, and health. Her first book, which is the topic of our lecture today, is called How the Other Half Eats. It draws on years of field research that she conducted on family diets in the San Francisco Bay Area. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, San Francisco Chronicle, Harvard Business Review, and others. I don't know about you, but I was thinking back to my time in elementary school, eating in the school cafeteria as I prepared for this lecture. At my elementary school, on the wall was a giant unmissable sign that reminded us that we are what we eat. And that was very dispiriting to us after we collected our food in the elementary school cafeteria, recognizing that this is all we amounted to. But there's a lot of truth in that statement, and we'll hear more about that today. Inequality in America manifests itself in many ways, but perhaps nowhere more than in how we eat. And so Dr. Fielding-Singh today is going to take us into the kitchens of dozens of families to explore both how we eat the way we do and why we eat the way we do. We're going to learn today about nutritional inequality in America through an in-depth examination of class, race, and health. So please join me in offering a warm welcome to Dr. Priya Fielding-Singh.
Well, thank you so much for that really kind introduction. And thank you to the Kennedy Center and BYU for the invitation to be here today. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to share some of my research with all of you this afternoon and to engage in a discussion afterward about some of my findings. So, as Professor Meekum mentioned, I'm a sociologist of health, family, and inequality, and today I'm going to be talking about a stream of research that features in my book, How the Other Half Eats. And in this research, I draw on years of fieldwork that I conducted on families' diets to examine how the symbolic meanings that food holds to mothers across the income spectrum help shape what goes on their children's plates, and how these meanings are also really central to understanding the nutritional inequalities that we see in this country. So I'm going to start by sharing a story with you about a mother whom I interviewed as a part of this research. So Faye Bautista was a low-income single mom who had emigrated from the Philippines to the San Francisco Bay Area in the early 1990s. And at the time that I met her, Faye was going through a really rough patch. 2 months earlier, she'd been laid off from her job as a janitor. And a few weeks after that, unable to keep up with the rent, Faye had been evicted from the apartment that she and her 15-year-old daughter, Melanie, called home. Oh, I realize this is actually...
Point it back here.
Oh, point it back there. Let's see. Oh, okay. Let's see if I can get it to go one more. Okay, I think we have it. So fortunately, a friend of Faye's knew of a shared apartment with a few spare rooms. And so Faye rented 2 of those out, giving one to Melanie and sharing the other with her boyfriend. Let's see. Okay. Nope. Okay. I need to be more patient. I'm like clicking ahead. So the evening that I met Faye, she and I sat kitty corner at the kitchen table in her shared apartment. At the time, Faye was collecting unemployment benefits, which helped pay the rent, utilities, and their cell phones. And the rest of the money, Faye told me, really matter-of-factly, went to buying Melanie takeout for lunch and dinner. These 2 meals, Faye estimated, cost her around $35 a day. Indeed, about 20 minutes into our conversation, I watched Melanie walk from her bedroom, where she had been doing homework, into the kitchen, her arm outstretched and her palm up, and I watched Faye place the dollar bills in her daughter's hand. We spend a lot of money for food, she told me. Whatever Melanie wants. Okay. In that moment with Faye, I found myself thinking of so many low-income moms who I'd interviewed, whose spending echoed Faye's. And I grappled with 2 questions. First, why would someone like Faye spend almost all of her disposable income on relatively expensive takeout when she could spend just a fraction as much on a cheaper meal? And second, how can Faye's choices help us understand how other families in America, those with more and those with fewer resources, eat? So by the end of this talk, my objective is to provide you with a few answers to those questions. But first, perhaps a question you're asking yourself is, why was I sitting down with Faye in the first place? So when I was a PhD student interested in researching health disparities, I was repeatedly struck by one disparity relating to something that I did, something that we all do multiple times a day. I'm talking here about diet disparities. I was struck by the glaring disparities in the nutritional quality of what families eat in this country. Disparities that affect both adults and children alike, disparities that have existed for decades, and disparities that routinely privilege higher income, highly educated white Americans over those with less income, less formal education, and people of color. For instance, compared to adults with higher incomes, lower income individuals consume fewer fruits and vegetables, more sugar-sweetened beverages, and they have overall lower diet quality. They're also significantly more likely to experience food insecurity. That is, they're more likely to not have consistent, reliable access to enough food to eat. So why do these disparities matter? Well, these disparities matter because of just how much our diets matter for our health and well-being. Disparities in our nutritional intake help drive broader health disparities across society. And a low-quality diet is consistently linked with multiple chronic diseases, including cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure, several types of cancer, type 2 diabetes. In fact, a lot of people don't know that in the United States, a low-quality diet is actually the leading cause of mortality, causing 500,000 deaths per year. This is all to say, without sounding too dramatic, that what we eat is literally a matter of life and death. And the seriousness of this matter means that there's really an urgency in answering the question of what drives nutritional inequality. That is, what accounts for the dietary gap between the most and the least privileged in American society. Now, about a decade ago, a number of academics, policymakers, and advocates alike started to coalesce around one central answer to this question. And they proposed that differences in access to healthy food drive differences in diet. And scholars tended to focus on two kinds of access. So the first kind is geographic access. And many of you may be actually pretty familiar with this concept of geographic access because of its association with the term food desert. And the basic thrust of this argument is that there are spatial disparities in families' access to healthy food, with lower income and families of color more likely to live in neighborhoods without supermarkets or fresh fruits and vegetables. And the idea is that if you struggle to physically get a hold of fruits and vegetables, it's going to be much harder, if not impossible, to eat a healthy diet, especially when compared to those who have ready access. The second type of access was financial, with the basic argument here being that over the past 30 years, on a calorie basis, healthy food has become more expensive than unhealthy food. And so for lower income families with less money to spend on food, foregoing a pricier but arguably more nutritious stir fry in favor of a cheaper but arguably less nutritious cheeseburger makes perfect financial sense. Now, the popularity of the food access arguments was in many ways spurred by the Let's Move campaign in 2010 to reduce childhood obesity. And this campaign basically popularized the idea that childhood obesity stemmed in part from inadequate geographic food access. And the argument had really wide appeal because it offered a straightforward, actionable solution. If access was the problem, then the fix was clear: open supermarkets in low-income communities. The result would be that families' nutrition would improve and obesity rates would fall. And so eliminating food deserts became a really central element of the campaign. And over the next decade, really Herculean policy efforts followed to increase low-income communities' access to healthy food. Whoops. But if the goal of those efforts was to improve families' diet quality and reduce obesity, then these initiatives' impacts were actually surprisingly disappointing, as researchers showed that increasing food access did little, if anything, to change families' diets. In fact, a 2019 econometric analysis suggested that food access accounts for just 10% of the nutritional gap in the United States, which means that 90% of dietary differences are not due to food access. And the authors of this study argue that the other 90% is due to differences in consumer demand. And prior scholarship points us toward many key factors that could yield such demand-side differences, from disparities in health and nutrition literacy, to differences in education, to inequalities in time available to cook and prepare healthy food, as well as really significant inequities in exposure to marketing from the food and beverage industry. However, as a sociologist, I've always been struck by an assumption underlying many of these explanations, an assumption that, to my mind, can actually limit their explanatory power. And that assumption is that food's value to people is solely material. The idea that people eat simply to nourish themselves and physically survive. And under this assumption, it should be relatively easy to change families' dietary behaviors. Simply replace a fast food establishment with a full-service supermarket, and people will individually change how they eat to reflect that broader structural change. Now, certainly on the most basic level, physical survival is what food is about, but we all know that food is about so much more than that. Food doesn't just have material meaning to us. Food also carries really tremendous symbolic meanings to us, and by that, What I mean is that what we eat serves really critical social, cultural, and emotional roles in our lives. We eat to connect with others. We eat to show love and affection. We eat to remember who we are and where we came from and what we believe in. And so because we know that food carries tremendous symbolic meanings to us, more deeply understanding what drives nutritional inequality requires answering two related research questions. So first, how do families vary in the symbolic meanings they assign to food? That is, what does food mean to families across society? And second, how do these symbolic meanings shape how families eat? That is, how does what food means to you shape your diet? So to answer these questions, I conducted a qualitative research study on family dietary practices. As a mixed method sociologist, my choice of qualitative methods here was really strategic because I had really open-ended research questions. I wanted to use methods that would allow me to generate new insights from the ground up. And to do that, I collected two data sets. So the first data set involved in-depth interviews among 75 families sampled across income. And I say among 75 families here because within each family, I conducted interviews with parents and children. And I focused especially on families that had teenagers because the teenage years represent a particularly vulnerable time for diet quality, as kids' diets tend to decrease in quality when they become adolescents. Overall, I conducted interviews with 75 families, and there were differences in how many parents and kids I was able to speak to in each family, but overall I conducted 160 interviews. Okay. In addition, I gathered ethnographic data with 4 families that I had selected from my interview sample. And for months, I lived alongside these families, embedded in their everyday experiences. I observed families as they went about all kinds of activities, from back to school nights to Sunday morning church services. I attended birthday parties, chopped fruit at kitchen counters, sat in the drive-thru and stood outside food banks with them. And my goal through this kind of deep on-the-ground observation was to understand the role that food played in their lives and the meanings that food took on given their really different contexts. Finally, because we know that income is often correlated with other family sociodemographic characteristics, I built variation into each income group in my sample in the domains of race, ethnicity, family composition, and parental employment. And so what that means is that within each income group, so for instance, within the high income group, there were Black, Latinx, Asian, white, and multiracial families, 2-parent families and single-parent families, families with 2 working parents, and families with a stay-at-home parent. Okay. Overall, I collected an extensive data set which I coded using qualitative content analysis, and I'm very happy in the Q&A to answer any specific questions about my methods. As the site for my research, I chose a place known for inequality, the San Francisco Bay Area, a place where the top 1% of income earners make 44 times more than everyone else. A place where, in doing this research, I interviewed families living in their RVs, just a stone's throw from those living in multi-million-dollar mansions. It's a place where I recruited families standing in food bank lines, just a stone's throw away from those dining in Michelin star restaurants. And while the Bay Area's juxtaposition of affluence and poverty can feel extreme, it's also increasingly characteristic of American life. In an age of rising inequality, the region has been more of a trendsetter than an outlier. And so while the families in my study lived in the Bay Area, the story I'm going to tell you today, I'm going to suggest is an American story. Today's story is also one of socioeconomic and racial inequality, and it's one that centers primarily on mothers who, in modern American society, still remain largely children's primary caregivers, as well as the parent responsible for grocery shopping, meal prepping, and cooking meals. There are so many other stories to tell from these data, and many of them I do tell in my book, but today's story really focuses on the meaning that food takes on to moms who are trying to feed their kids. So before I dive into the inequalities that I uncovered in my research, I have to start with a commonality that bound all of the families that I met. And that commonality was that mothers across the income spectrum valued their children's diets and health. Most mothers that I spoke with mentioned the importance of a healthy diet for their child, and they connected the dots between healthy eating and their kids' current or future health. So low-income moms like Miranda Kirk, who told me, "You are what you eat. Food is your medicine. As a mom, you tell them as much as you possibly can throughout their life. Your health is going to depend on what you put into your body, period." Or high-income moms like Alma Garcia, who told me, "I feel like food is an investment in our long-term overall health." And yet, despite these shared values, families reported diets of varying quality. In particular, lower-income families reported purchasing and consuming more processed, non-perishable products, the stuff that tends to line kitchen cabinets rather than refrigerator shelves. So what explained these differences in consumption that I was seeing across the families in my sample? So to answer this question, the first thing that I did was I turned to the prevailing explanations in the field about what should be accounting for these differences. So in this case, I turned to the food access arguments. So in my sample, geographic access offered pretty little explanatory power. Most of the families in my sample, which it's worth noting is a largely urban or suburban sample, did not reside in food deserts. I knew where every family lived because I had conducted interviews in families' homes, and I also could use the United States Department of Agriculture's food desert tracker to see whether families lived in a low-access area, and most of the families in my study did not. But even more than this sort of objective measure of food access, subjectively, geographic food access was not a concern that rose to the top of mothers' explanations. Mothers told me all kinds of challenges when it came to feeding their families, but physically getting a hold of the food that they wanted or needed was not one of them. Financial access offered a much more promising explanation. To be sure, low-income families spent less money on food each month. Many received federal food assistance. A majority were food insecure. And low-income mothers reported being far more price-oriented in their food purchases. At the same time, low-income moms told me that they weren't always guided by price. In fact, moms like Faye Bautista, who I introduced at the beginning of this talk, reported that sometimes they spent more money than they otherwise would in order to meet their kids' food requests. But it wasn't just low-income moms whose kids bombarded them with requests for junk food. Across income, mothers faced pressure from kids to buy them unhealthy foods. Now, this is really far from surprising, given the $1.8 billion in marketing that the food and beverage industry spends every single year to cultivate in children a desire for sugary drinks, sugary snacks, and fast food. And yet, I discovered that high, middle, and low-income mothers in my sample navigated these pressures really differently. So, through mothers' reports to me about how they responded to their kids' requests, I generated a really simple count of how many mothers in each income group said that they regularly denied their kids' food requests for health reasons. While 96% of high-income moms told me this, 54% and just 13% of low-income moms said the same. Now, I want to be clear that it's not that low-income moms never said no. They just told me that when they said no, it was because they didn't have the money, not because of a health concern. Together, my analysis of mothers' reports and explanations paired with my own ethnographic observations generated a new finding about the dietary differences across families. And that finding was that moms' feeding practices stemmed in part from what food symbolically meant to them. And those meanings were really fundamentally shaped by the socioeconomic context they were raising their children in. So in my book, I showcase these different symbolic meanings through the stories of 4 mothers across the income spectrum that I ethnographically observed for the research. Naya Baker, a low-income Black mother living far below the poverty line. Dana Williams, a low-income white mother living just above it. Renata Ortega, a middle-income Latina mother. And Julie Kane, a high-income white mother. So today, because of the short time that we have, I'm going to focus on the symbolic meaning that food took on to low-income moms and tell Naya's story while weaving in insights from the other mothers that I interviewed. I do want to be clear, though, that while I focus primarily on this one story, Naya's experiences are not unique to her, but rather they reflect broader trends in my data about how lower-income moms assign symbolic meaning to food. So Naya was a single Black low-income mother of 2 daughters, Mariah and Natasha. And the November day that I met Naya, the 2 of us found ourselves standing outside of a social service agency at 6 o'clock in the morning, bundled up to brave the 40-degree weather. Naya was there lined up with dozens of other parents to register for a Christmas toy drive so that she would have something to give Mariah and Natasha for the holidays. And I was there because I was looking for families to participate in my research. And when I told Naya about my study, she was instantly interested because I was compensating families with $60 for participating in an interview. And for Naya, money was tight, and it was always on her mind. Naya had not had the opportunity to finish high school, and she had made ends meet over the past 15 years by working a string of low-wage, precarious jobs, from cleaning dorm rooms to bussing tables. And one of the first things that really struck me about Naya, and that I came over time to admire about Naya, was that she was not one to sugarcoat. She was extremely candid, and she took pride in telling it like it was. And Naya's honesty extended to how she talked about her family's diet, which she believed was not as healthy as it could be. Naya told me, "I think we're eating way unhealthy because of a lot of the snacks. Of course I know that's junk food. I'm gonna keep it real, I buy a lot of junk food. Snacks like donuts, Nutty Buddies, the popcorn and stuff like that, chips, sodas." Now, one reason that Naya bought these foods was that Mariah and Natasha asked for them all the time. Naya told me, "They always want potato chips, the cheesy kinds, Cheese Puffs or Cheetos. Like some things they do ask me, and I don't like to buy that stuff for them, I end up getting it. And then she paused for a moment before adding, you know, they win. They win all the time. I'll use this as a natural break. But it's worth noting that it wasn't only Naya's kids who won. Other lower income moms echoed Naya in sharing that they too often obliged their kids' foods requests. So moms like Margaret Nicholson, who told me about her kids, they're the ones who choose it. Whatever they like is what we eat. I really cater to what they like, so we do eat a lot of pizza, corn dogs, hot dogs, fish sticks, and tater tots, stuff like that. So how can we make sense of why moms like Margaret and Naya said yes to their kids, even when they knew full well that these foods were unhealthy and when they also valued their kids' diets and health? Making sense of this requires understanding what it means to mother in a context of financial scarcity and insecurity, two hallmark features of living in poverty today. So the summer that I spent with Naya was one of the toughest summers she had ever experienced. A few months earlier, a series of health issues had left Naya unable to work. And while Naya had filed for disability payments that spring, at the time that I observed her family, she was yet to see any of those payments come in. So in the meantime, Naya constructed a sort of formal and informal safety net for herself. She lived largely off of Social Security benefits that she received for her daughter's learning disabilities, as well as her boyfriend's SNAP benefits. And most of that money went really fast. It went to rent, utilities, garbage, cell phone bills, and cable. And it left Naya with really little disposable cash. So that summer, without any money, there was very little to do. Naya once summed it up nicely when she said, "You need cash to do stuff." But Naya didn't have cash. So most of the time that I spent with her and her family that summer, we spent it sitting on the couch in her garage, watching TV and eating junk food. And Naya explained to me what she had told her daughters at the outset of summer, when she knew that it was going to be a tough few months and she wasn't going to have much to give them. She said, "I told them it's not all about fancy clothes and fancy cars. Be happy you have a roof over your head, you have food in here. You can watch TV when you want to and use the bathroom whenever you want to. You have a fan inside to go to when you get hot and a blanket to get under when you're cold." And then she turned to me and said, "I'm just trying to survive." And in trying to survive, Naya had to say no all the time. She had to say no to her kids about the big things like vacation or summer camp. And she had to say no to them about the medium-sized things too, like a new pair of jeans or a replacement for a shattered phone screen. And as I watched Naya say no again and again and again to her daughter's requests, I realized something so simple, that in this world of no, food was actually something that Naya could say yes to. Naya could almost always find the buck at the bottom of her purse to buy her kids a can of soda or a bag of chips. There was almost always a sofa cushion that could be overturned to reveal a few coins that could help buy a candy bar. And so when Naya could say yes, she did say yes. Like later that afternoon when we went to the supermarket and Natasha asked for this, Naya said yes. Or another afternoon when we drove by a Starbucks and Mariah wanted this, Naya said yes. And every single time the ice cream truck turned the corner towards Naya's house and that familiar jingle grew gradually louder in volume, Naya instinctively gave each of her kids $1 to go get whatever they wanted. Now, as much as Naya's desire to say yes to her kids stemmed from a longing to provide for them, that desire simultaneously stemmed from something else. And that something else relates to the kind of mom that Naya wanted to be, the kind of mom that most mothers in this country aspire to be. So in the United States, we share really deeply held beliefs about what makes women good mothers. Sociologists refer to these beliefs as the ideology of intensive mothering, a coin termed by the sociologist Sharon Hayes in 1996 to describe the unreasonable, unattainably high standards to which mothers are held in this country. The intensive mothering ideology specifies that good moms must act as their kids' primary caregivers. Good mothering is centered around the child. It's labor-intensive and resource-demanding. Good moms are self-sacrificing. They put kids' needs before their own to ensure kids' happiness and well-being. And good moms, according to society, are generally regarded as white, married to men, and affluent. This is all to say that being a good mom in the US is a highly exclusionary ideal, attainable only to some and through the highest levels of selflessness and devotion and resources. And yet, despite being out of reach, sociological research shows that moms across society aspire to intensive motherhood. Naya, for one, knew that the color of her skin and the lack of wedding ring on her finger meant that she would never fit society's image of a good mom. She was reminded of that every single day of her life, whether at the pediatrician's office or in a meeting with her social worker. But self-sacrificing and child-centered, these were things that she and other low-income moms could try for. They could work to always put their kids first, to subvert their own needs for their children, and to put whatever resources they had at whatever moment they happened to have them towards their kids' happiness. For mothers like Naya, saying yes to food actually reflected a deep commitment to intensive mothering. The daily act of saying yes and bringing smiles to her daughters' faces offered Naya a chance to feel like a good mom. It suggested to her that maybe she was a better, more competent mother than the world generally cast her as. You see, for mothers like Naya who were living in poverty, financial scarcity yielded a scarcity of opportunities to provide for children. And that meant that there was a scarcity of opportunities to communicate love to children, to show them that moms heard them, they saw them, and they could give them not just what they needed, but also some of what kids wanted. One mom summed up the symbolic potency of food in this context when she told me about her daughters. The way I feel about food is like, if they need food and they're hungry, then I'm gonna buy it. I don't care how much money's in my pocket. I'll spend my last $20. One day, they'll know I love them and that's all that matters. If she wants a $2 candy bar, I get it for her if I have it. So deep was this desire to make kids happy amid scarcity that both low-income moms I observed, Naya and Dana, gave most of the compensation they received for participating in the ethnography portion of this study directly to their children. So Naya and Dana each received $300 in cash at the end of the observation component of the study. And in both cases, they took $200 of that money and split it between their two daughters. Naya, for one, gave Mariah and Natasha each $100, and she told them to spend it however they wanted, which they did. They went to the mall, they got fast food and candy, they got new clothes, and they had what Naya told me was the best week of their entire summer. This is a woman who I once saw haggle with a cell phone agent to get $1 off her cell phone bill, and she took $200 and gave it to her daughters just to give them a few days of happiness. Then Naya paid some bills, she put some gas in the car, and then she said yes to herself with a bag of Doritos and an 18-pack of beer. Dana, similarly, put the money towards her daughters. Then she got herself a really nice haircut and color and took her oldest daughter out for sushi. Now, it's interesting to note here, too, that neither Naya nor Dana considered spending the money, as some might think they should or would have, to buy healthy food for their families. For these moms within the context of financial scarcity, the symbolic punch of saying yes to their kids was worth far more than any healthy meal. So in contrast to how low-income mothers' food choices are often cast, I found that moms like Naya use food to be responsible caregivers, to show their kids that they love and care for them, and to demonstrate maternal worth to themselves and others. But the context within which they're raising their children shapes how they accomplish that goal. So for lower income moms, food can be a symbolic antidote in a context of financial scarcity. Moms can use food to buffer kids against hardship and to compensate for other forms of deprivation. And in doing so, they can find daily evidence that they are good moms. And understanding this, particularly understanding how families' context can shape what food means to them, can also help us evaluate foods like these, not just from a public health or nutritional standpoint, but also from a sociological one. Giving your kid a bag of Cheetos can actually be a genuine display of love and care when understood within a context of financial scarcity. The final question, though, is if food's meanings are in part driving food choices, then what can we do about it? How can we intervene? And that's where I want to end today's talk. And I want to propose 3 avenues forward, although there are certainly many more that exist. And the first 2 of these, I want to propose that we think about intervening with children, because my research shows that parents do not unilaterally decide what kids eat, but rather children, through their preferences, their requests, and their pickiness, can shape what gets eaten at home. So how can we shift kids' preferences and, in turn, change families' diets? So the first thing we can do is we can intervene with marketing food and beverages to kids. Why were the kids in my study nagging their moms for junk food in the first place? Well, one reason is that the food and beverage industry spends billions of dollars every year cultivating them a desire for those foods and driving those requests. If we were to regulate some of this marketing, if kids weren't bombarded with ads for tasty, unhealthy foods all the time, they might stop asking their parents for them nonstop. The second place we can intervene is where kids spend most of the week and where 31 million children consume 2 meals a day every day. We can fund and support schools to become hubs of nutritional nourishment and education, not only by reducing their exposure to junk food within school bowls, but also by offering nutritious and appealing meals to kids that would, 1, take some of the responsibility and pressure off of mothers, and also help cultivate in kids a taste for healthier foods. So rather than putting all the responsibility of making kids eat a healthy diet on mom's shoulders, schools could shoulder some of that responsibility as well. Ultimately, though, the solutions that we need on the largest scale are ones that can actually shift families or food's meaning for poor families in America. What we need are sweeping structural reforms that strengthen the safety net for struggling families. And this could take many shapes, from legislating a livable wage for moms like Naya, to expanding access to affordable housing, to creating tax credits to families with children. If we can enact policies that effectively and enduringly lift families out of poverty, then we can also help shift the meaning of food. We can make it so that a bag of Cheetos is just a bag of Cheetos, rather than a potent symbol of love and care amidst a backdrop of scarcity. So thank you so much for your time and attention, and I look forward to your questions.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much. We do have about 15 minutes for questions. We're going to go until 1 o'clock. If you have a question, if you could come up and speak into the microphone so that our recording can pick you up. Introduce yourself by name, and if you're a student at BYU, what you're studying. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't think it's on. You can hear it? You can hear it? Okay, I'll talk loudly. I'm Sherry Solberg, and I'm in family studies. So my question is, I grew up in Canada, where parents do receive a monthly stipend for their children, and I'm wondering if, based on your research, if you think that would actually be spent on healthy food, or if it would actually go to other things.
I mean, I think, yeah, that's a really great question. Thanks for raising that. So a couple of things. So I do think that those types of stipends are extremely effective at reducing one kind of inequality around food that we have, which is food insecurity, in the sense that when we give families more money for food, they do spend it on food, and it does help reduce hunger in the household. Now, the nutritional implications are a little bit more unclear. Some of the best research that I've seen suggests that increasing like SNAP allotments doesn't actually do that much to change the nutritional quality of what families eat, unless there are also regulations around what they can spend it on. So in the United States, the Women, Infant, Children Supplemental Nutrition Program, WIC, is one of the only programs that has really clear kind of rules around what you can buy with it. And what we know from that program is that the diets of people who are on WIC are significantly better than those who are kind of similar but not on WIC. The other stuff that I've seen that's really encouraging is creating food allotments where you basically can buy double the amount of food if you are spending it on fruits and vegetables. So it's called double up bucks, which basically if you were going to spend some money on fruits and vegetables in particular, they'll increase the allotment. And that is actually really effective in getting people to buy healthier food. And part of it is that it makes it less of a trade-off, right? They can also buy the treats for their children, which honestly will always be a part of families and kids' diets, but it also incentivizes buying other foods that are healthier.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Carly Peterson. I'm a psychology major here at BYU, and I thought it was interesting how you brought up that mothers from all socioeconomic groups really valued their children's health and wellness and diet. And I was curious as to whether or not this was a variable that you evaluated, but whether kind of the idea of diet culture and what's popular as far as in the popular media as to what is actually healthy for you and not healthy for you had an influence on the symbolism that people associated with food, and as well as if there was a difference in that between the different socioeconomic groups.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. Yeah, so, right, it's actually, I'm glad that you bring up diet culture, because all of this takes place within a broader diet culture that shapes how we think and talk about healthy food, and also the explicit or implicit connection that all of us make between food and weight and appearance, right? And so for the mothers in my study, they cared on a basic level about diet and healthy eating, in the sense that they wanted their kids to eat fruits and vegetables, simply to eat fruits and vegetables and derive the nutritional benefits of that. At the same time, mothers also did connect the dots between what their kids ate and their children's weight. And often, and this happens in part because it's reinforced in places like pediatricians' offices, they received feedback about how they were feeding their children based on how much their children weighed, which there is a connection there, but it's not always kind of the really clear, direct connection that we think about. And so a lot of mothers also worried about what their children were eating because they didn't want them to fall outside of the normal BMI range. And any parent knows that when you go to the pediatrician's office, the first thing that they do is they weigh your child and measure their height, and they tell you if your kid is normal, right? And so these kind of messages are reinforced around what a healthy weight is, and this connection is always made that if a kid's weight falls outside that range, that the mother is doing something wrong, that she's not feeding her kid correctly. So those were definitely concerns on mothers' minds that spanned the income spectrum. What was different was that for lower income moms, particularly lower income Black and Latina moms, live with an ever-present threat that their children could be taken away. They live under increased state surveillance and live under the fear that if their kid's weight does fall outside of the kind of normal range, that their kid is deemed too scrawny, then it might suggest that they're not feeding their kid enough, and so their kid could be taken away. So the stakes for lower income, particularly mothers of color, were a lot higher, and in part also shaped a desire to have kids eat. The worst thing could be that a kid was underfed. So you always want to make sure your kid at least looks like they're fed, they're not going hungry at home. And so I think that also shaped kind of how they thought about feeding and those differences across race and class. So thank you so much for that question.
Hi, my name is Spencer Topham. I was just wondering, what's something we could do as individuals to start making changes? Because it seems like more like what we focus on is more like broad group changes, but that's nothing, I can't do anything about that today.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, as a sociologist, I tend to always talk about the really structural things. Also because just realistically, as individuals, there's probably not a ton that we can be doing to enact large-scale change that we need to make a dent on these inequalities. But there are some things that you can be doing as an individual actor. So one of the first things, and this is kind of one of the goals of my research, is to change the way that we think and talk about people's food choices. In America, we tend to think about food really through a personal responsibility lens, that if people eat well, it's because they have good willpower and they care and they want to be healthy, and if people don't, it's because they're lazy or negligent. And my work is really trying to reframe that conversation in a way that all of us, when we walk away from this talk, can in the future talk about food and inequality in more structural terms, in ways that don't blame individuals, but rather see our diets as shaped by these broader forces. Other things you can do can be to advocate in your community for restrictions around marketing to children. I don't have a lot of faith that we're gonna change the situation for marketing overall to adults, but in community centers or in schools, in places where we gather, can we be more thoughtful about the food that we're offering kids, that we're selling at baseball games, or that we're stocking in a vending machine? Can we change the food environment in a way that doesn't make unhealthy eating the default and make it difficult for parents to feed their kids the ways that they want? A lot of other work that you can be doing isn't necessarily focused on nutrition, but it is a really important part of the story of food inequality, which is addressing food insecurity. There's a huge movement right now to address food insecurity among college students on college campuses, creating food banks that actually offer nutritious, healthy, and culturally relevant food. So thinking about on this campus or in other spaces that you may be, could there actually be a hidden hunger problem that you could be thinking about and working to address? So those are some ideas that come to mind. Thank you for that question.
Hi. Thanks for your talk. I'm Andrea Busby. I'm faculty in the School of Family Life, and I do some research on how parents socialize their children about economic inequality. And so I'm kind of wondering, and you touched on it a little bit when you answered him, but I'm wondering if you're seeing any differences by the groups in kind of how they talk about how other people eat, or do they talk about how other people eat, or is it primarily, with their children, how we eat?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there's kind of multiple layers to the answer. Particularly with higher income families and mothers, they had an awareness of kind of the privilege that they had, and talked about things like food deserts and food access, and we don't face those challenges. So some kind of broad awareness of inequality, that the deck is not necessarily stacked in favor of other families. At the same time, in the immediate moment, the reference group that higher income families often used was other higher income families that they knew. Because those were the families that they saw every day in the school parking lot or around their neighborhoods. Those were the families that they related to the most. And those were kind of the people that they were often comparing their own diets to. And the same thing goes for lower income families. Lower income families would talk about we can't shop at Whole Foods, we can't buy organic, some people can. But then when in evaluating whether they were doing a good job feeding their kids or not, they were using other families in their neighborhood or in their schools as the reference point. So I would say there was sort of almost like a diffuse understanding of inequality, but not in like a real sense in the way that like it shaped how they actually thought about the ways that they were feeding their kids.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
So with one of the stories of the families you were talking about of how she ordered takeout for the $12, whatnot, I'm curious about the effect of time and energy to create nutritious meals or to be able to cook meals, and then also the time required to go to the grocery store and energy required, because I know sometimes across all economic statuses you have it where your job is really tiring, or you're working a lot of hours, or you're spending so much stress and energy and emotional strength trying to figure out what to do for work that you're unable to spend time on nutrition. What patterns did you see across the different statuses? Yeah,
I'm so glad you brought that up. So time was a really big thing, but was sort of socioeconomically patterned in the sense that I think like moms across the income spectrum felt like they didn't have time, especially mothers who were employed full time. Like time kind of came up just in almost every interview. But higher income moms could often use money to kind of compensate for time scarcity. Like they could pick up something at Whole Foods. I've mentioned Whole Foods because it just comes up so much in my interviews. It's sort of like this signifier of healthy eating. So they could use money to buffer. Lower income moms didn't have those same buffers. And a lot of lower income moms also talked about like, they worked on their feet 12 hours a day. And the last thing that they wanted to do when they came home was go stand in the kitchen on their feet again and prepare a meal. But what's also really important to like weave into our understanding of this is that another really top concern for lower income moms who often didn't have a ton of time with their kids was making sure that the time that they did have with their kids was really pleasant. And one of the ways to do that is to give your kids what they ask for and to make sure that your kids are happy with the food that they're eating. And so in this way, like kids' preferences also exerted this influence, right? Like if you come home from work and you have a half hour to spend with your child, do you necessarily want to like argue about broccoli and brown rice? Maybe not. Like maybe you just want to put a frozen pizza in the oven and like sit with your kid and have a nice conversation. And so in my book, I actually kind of talk about how we think about time as a quantitative thing, which it is, but there's also a qualitative element to it in the sense of like, how does one want to spend their time, and how does one's job, one's socioeconomic environs, like how does that shape what quality time means? So yeah, I'm really glad that you raised this point of time, and it's a really important one.
Awesome.
Thank you.